Hey everyone, welcome back to the bonus section where we'll be looking at integrating Google Maps into our application so that we can get live information from Google about these places. Now, in order for us to do this, we're going to be using something called Firebase functions, which enable us to run a mobile backend without the need to manage servers, meaning we're going to be deploying code that's going to run on the cloud in Firebase, and it's going to expose to us an endpoint from which we will receive information that comes from Google. Now, you can read up on Firebase functions over here, and in actuality, what it basically is, it's a little piece of code that's going to run on a server, and it's going to do an API call for us to Google in order to do our search and retrieval of information. Now, a very, very important note we need to make here. Very important. For this portion of the course, we are going to be upgrading from the free plan to the pay-as-you-go plan, which also has free limits. It has free limits up to 2 million invocations a month, 400,000 requests of gigabits per second. Now, the free tier does not allow us to run functions unless we use Node version 8. This is a big limitation as Node has moved way beyond and will potentially later on be removed. So we want to be able to use Firebase in a way that allows us to deploy these functions properly. This means you will have to update your plan to pay as you go and means you need payment information. And the same is true for Google Maps. In order for us to use Google Maps, there is a pay scale. It is pay as you go. Now, Google Maps also has a free amount of requests. You can do up to $200 per month of requests. But just note here that in order to do the complete section of the Firebase and Google Maps integration, you will need payment information, and we are not liable for any costs you may incur. However, we will teach you how to set up the cloud environment and teach you how to run your Fire function locally so that you can limit the amount of live costs you may incur. That being said, things can happen. I myself, during development, made a small mistake over here in the Google Maps platform, and I incurred 65,000 requests worth of costs. Now, that was a stressful evening right there. But luckily, I reached out to the Google platform team and they helped me out. They helped me fix everything. And they also gave me some tips and tricks that I'm going to be passing along to you in terms of setting up quotations, making sure that your Google Cloud is set up so that you can limit the amount of costs you can incur. That being said, nothing is 100% fail-proof. That's why you have to link payment information. You may incur some costs. You may not. It depends on how you utilize this section. And we're going to teach you as much as possible about how to use these services. If you do not have payment information, however, and you cannot do this bonus section, don't be afraid. You can run your Fire function, your Firebase function. You can run it locally. You will not be able to do the full integration to Google as you need payment information to talk to Google, but we will be migrating our mock information to a server environment, which you can invoke locally. Now, that said, this will mean that your app will be reliant on the server. So you have to be careful in how you approach this section, because if you cannot push your Fire function to the cloud, your app will only work locally because you will only locally have the Firebase function. So you can test this section out even if you don't have payment information up to a point. It is important to, though, realize that you do need payment information in order to complete this entire section. So with that said, and that out of the way, let's take a look at everything we need to put in place in order to set up our Firebase functions to build out a server. In this video, we're going to show you how to set up your payment information to upgrade from your Spark plan, just in case you do not have any payment information set up on Google. Now, if we press the upgrade button here, we can see the pay-as-you-go plan. And if we say select plan, it's going to tell us, hey, you want to go to the pay-as-you-go plan. You will now be charged based on your usage. And if we say continue, it's going to take us to the Google Cloud Console. Now, this Google Cloud Console is specifically for Firebase, and it's going to tell us a bunch of things that we have to agree to. Agree to add a billing account. Over here, you can see it's asking me to create a new billing account, and it's going to give it a name. It's going to give it a country and a currency. So select your country here that you live. When you press continue, it is then going to ask you to set up information about your personal or business. So if you're an individual, set up an individual and say some street. You do have to fill in real information here. So fill in where you live. The only reason I'm not filling in where I live is because I don't want the entire internet to know. Now over here, you're going to see that this individual lives at some street in some city in potentially Ontario. And let's say that he lives at M3J2PA or 2PO. And phone number is optional. It'll ask you about automatic payments. You'll have to fill in your credit card information here. And then once you submit and enable billing, you will be able to upgrade your Firebase instance to a paid plan. Now make sure that the information you fill in here is accurate, as otherwise the billing may be rejected. And now that you've done that, you should be able to see your Firebase set up in a way where if you go to the Meals to Go app and you try to upgrade your plan to pay as you go, it will automatically upgrade your project and you should be good to go. Now you can set a budget alert if you wish to, for instance, know at a certain amount where you stand. Great. So knowing that, we now know that we'll be able to set up our Firebase function and deploy it with a paid account. Now, if you're unable to put in a paid account here, don't worry. You'll still be able to run your Firebase function locally. You will not be able to integrate with Google Cloud, however. Now that we have our Firebase in a state in which we can deploy functions, the question becomes, Mo, how do we deploy functions? And what's important here is to realize that the docs point us in really, really solid directions. If we go to firebasegoogle.com and we go to functions, get started, it tells us basically everything we need to know about how to get started. Now, we already have a Firebase project, so we can skip step 1. But when we go to step 2, it says set up Node.js and Firebase CLI. Well, we already have Node.js set up, but Firebase CLI, And so over here it says you'll need Node.js to write functions, and you'll need Firebase CLI to deploy the functions to the cloud function runtime, meaning that any code that we write, we need to be able to push it up to Firebase so that Firebase can run it for us later on. Okay, now here's the star, or the important section. The important section is that Node.js versions 10, 12, and 14 are supported. 14 is under beta, however, I have tested it, and I find that it works just fine for what will be doing. So we will be using version 14. If you're on version 10 or 12, that is fine as well. But it's always best to be on the most recent LTS version, long-term support version. So it also says see set runtime docs for important information regarding ongoing support. So let's go over there, see runtime options. And it's going to tell us over here what runtime options are available. As you can see, Node.js 8 is deprecated as of June 8th, 2020. So that way we can keep track of what is supported by Firebase. If a newer version is supported here, please go ahead and take the newer version. Now with that, once we have Node and NPM installed, which we do, we need to install Firebase CLI through our preferred method. So over here, they give us a command, npm install -g Firebase tools. So let's copy that command. And if we go over to our terminal and we open up a new terminal, what we can do is we can run that command that will install the Firebase tools globally. And by installing them globally, we will in effect have access to the Firebase command. Now, it also says if this command fails, you may need to change your npm permissions. So if you're unable to run this command, you may need to change some permissions. And if we click this link, it will take us to help documentation that will outline what we may be seeing. And if this outlines what you may be seeing, you may want to follow these steps over here to resolve it. And that will allow you to set up your computer in a better place to be able to run this command. If it still fails, please reach out on our Discord community or on the QA section. But the Discord community often has a lot of students who have a lot of prior experience with dealing with certain errors, and we help each other out. So that's always a good option. Now, if we go back over to the docs, what we can see here is after we run npm install Firebase tools, it says here, in many cases, the new features and bug fixes are available only with the latest version of Firebase CLI. So we'll want to update the Firebase functions SDK. And so to frequently update these, you will have to run the following functions. Inside of our project, we can run npm install Firebase functions at latest, Firebase admin at latest. Now, once we set this up, we will get the latest version. But not that being said, you may run into an instance where later on, if you leave the project for a while, if it stagnates, you may have to come back to it and run these two commands in order to upgrade and get the latest version of Firebase functions. Okay, so once we have that, we can run something called Firebase login. Interesting. When you initialize the Firebase SDK for Cloud Functions to create an empty object, before we even go into that, we need to log in through the command line. So let's go over here and let's say, okay, it's installed. We've installed Firebase tools at 9.1.0. So if we do Firebase --help, what we'll see is that we have Firebase as a command available. Now that we know that we have it available as a command, we can run Firebase login. And this will say already logged in as Mobini. So if I do Firebase log out, then I will log out as Mobini. And if I do log in again, what it's going to do is it's going to ask me if it wants to collect error reporting information. I'm going to say no right now. It's going to take me into my browser. And it's going to ask me to select an account with which I want to log in. So I will log in with mo@bini.io. Now, this will ask from Firebase CLI certain permissions. View and manage data across the Google Cloud Platform. Administer your Firebase data. And take control of Cloud Platform projects. So we'll allow that. Once we've allowed that, it will say Firebase CLI login is successful. You are now logged into Firebase command line. And if we go back over to our command line, success, you logged in as Mobini. Awesome. Now that we are certain that we have access to our Firebase cloud and we are authenticated, well, over here you can see that step 2 and 3, it says go to your Firebase project directory. So our Firebase project is Meals to Go. And it says run Firebase in a Firestore. Well, we're not going to use the Firestore, so let's skip this one. And then it says Firebase init functions. Well, we're going to use functions. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Now, let's go ahead, take this over here and run this in the command line. Now it's going to ask us a bunch of questions, and it's going to say, well, do you want to use an existing project in your Firebase to link the functions to? Or do you want to create a new project? Or do you want to add it to an existing cloud platform project? What do you want to do? So we're going to say use an existing project. And over here, you can see I have 2 Meals to Go. You most likely have 1. And you can link it to that Meals to Go project. I only have 2 because I've tested Meals to Go a couple of times. So we're going to link it to Meals to Go. And by linking it, it's going to ask us in what language do you want to write your cloud functions? Well, JavaScript, of course. So let's select JavaScript. Do you want ESLint to catch problems and enforce style? We're going to say no here because we already have ESLint configured in our project and it will take over linting for us in the sub project. So we're going to say no here. And it's going to say that it's going to write the following files. So it wrote a package JSON, an index, and a git ignore. And it's asking us if we want to install our dependencies. We're going to say no here because we're going to install our dependencies ourselves. But first and foremost, what we want to do is over here, we want to see what it's added. It's added a firebase.json. Awesome. That's empty. It's added a Firebase RC in which our project has been specified. And so if we open up our functions folder, we can see that it's added a bunch of different information for us. It's added functions from Firebase functions which haven't been installed yet, and the index.js and all that good stuff. Now what we want to do is we want to go inside our git ignore. And first and foremost, let's add the node modules of the subfolder. And then let's add like that. Same, but we're going to also say that it can't track the node modules of the subfolder. Let's do git status. And what we can see here is that it's tracking these 3 folders now. Awesome. Okay, so with that, we're now ignoring the node modules inside of here. And if we go inside of functions, what we can do is we can run yarn. And then it's going to say, the engine node is not compatible with this module, expected version 12. Well, what node version am I running? Oh, I'm running 14. Okay, so let's go inside our functions. Let's go inside our package JSON and let's update this to 14. You may need to update this to the node version you are currently running. So always remember to run node -v. And if we then do yarn, it will install all of the dependencies for the Firebase function. And if we do git status here, now we can see that everything is being tracked inside of our folder. If we go 1 level up, so we're tracking the RC, the JSON, and the functions folder. If we look at exactly what is inside of our index function, currently there is no Firebase function available. But we've set up everything in a good spot so that in the next video, let's take a look at how we run this actual function and what goes into it. Now that we have all of our dependencies installed and Firebase functions set up properly, we can go over to the package JSON, and what we can see here is that it has different scripts it can run. Scripts meaning that it is able to serve individual functions for Firebase out of the box. Now the ones that we have is serve, shell, start, deploy, and logs. All of these have a very specific function. Deploy is going to deploy it live, and the shell is going to start a shell interface. The serve is going to serve it locally, and the logs is going to show us logs. Okay, so with that, the 2 most important ones we need to keep in our mind right now, as we're building something fairly simple, is the serve and the deploy. The deploy is going to push it live, so it's going to be hosted on Firebase at that point. And the serve is going to host it locally. Now, why would we want to host it locally, Mo? Why would we want to take our function and try it out locally? Well, while we're developing, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to test what we're doing in a local environment, so that if we did anything wrong at all, a for loop that went wrong, an infinite loop that's happening, anything at all, it can be caught before it goes live into production and potentially incurs us costs. And we have the benefit of developing locally before pushing globally, so we can test everything out locally. So what happens if we do yarn serve? Well, if we run yarn serve right now, it's going to host our functions on localhost 5001. And we can see it in the emulator UI through localhost 4000 function. Now it's saying watching the directory functions for cloud function. Interesting. So it's watching the directory. Right now we don't have any cloud functions. And if we go look at index.js, well, everything is disabled. So if we remove the marks over here and we save so that we use our ESLint and our prettier, what we're going to see is that, initialize the function http 5001/meals2go, so our project ID, /uscentral1/hello world. So this has become a function that is now being served locally by the Firebase emulator suite. So this is something that's emulating Firebase itself on our local machine so that we can run functions for Firebase, test them out on our machine. Okay, so what happens if I go to this URL directly? Well, it's going to say hello from Firebase. And hello from Firebase is exactly what we put in the response.send. Now, this is basically a Node.js function. It's a server, but it's running on Firebase as a singular instance, one function that's just going to do something for us. So if we say hello from Firebase, what we're going to see over here is if we refresh, oh, and it updated. And over here, we can see how it updated, why it updated, when it updated, what execution it is currently running. So we can test all of that out. We can test our Firebase functions on our local machine. Super useful. And if you see any issues, you can report them, and you have the log inside of your terminal as well. That is so, so powerful. These are how we write functions. Okay, so what do we do now, Mo? Well, obviously we have this hello world, and obviously we have this different way that we need to write our functions. This doesn't really look like how we've written our React code, and that is completely fine because our Firebase functions are going to be written differently. Don't try to use import syntax here. Don't try to use anything fancy. We have to follow the structure that is given to us. And with that structure, we can build out two simple functions that are going to talk to Google for us. But before we do that, what I want us to do is I want us to migrate a portion of our app that is supplying us with mock information, right? We have mock information for locations, and we have mock information for our current restaurant searches. And I want us to move them into the Firebase function that is going to function as what's going to talk to Google, so that we can link our actual app to quote unquote server. So we're going to move everything that was mock into these functions. And then once we have these functions running locally with the mock and the app running in the same way, then we can start talking about building out our infrastructure to talk to Google. So let's get started on that. It's time to migrate our Meals to Go app to use our Firebase function locally to supply it with mock data. That is going to be the first step in our process towards integrating with Google. And now, if you do not have a paid account, you can still do the step of moving the mocked data into the Firebase function. Now, note here that when you do move it over from the app into the local server, your app will no longer be usable if you expo publish it without deploying the server. This is a very important thing that we need to note, as it will affect your app. But you can try it out. You can for sure try this out, see how it works. Just be aware that this may happen. Okay, so now over here we have the hello world function, and it takes a request and a response. Now what we're going to do is we're going to rename this. We're going to name it geocode. Now why are we going to name it geocode? Because the first API that we're going to integrate with is the Google Geocode API, geocoding API. This is an API that takes a place and then translates it into a longitude, latitude. Now, the service in our app is called location. However, since we're integrating with something called geocode, our Firebase function is going to be called geocode. Now, this geocode function is going to call something called a geocode request. And that geocode request is going to take the request parameter from the Firebase function and the response parameter. And what it's going to do with them is it's going to use them internally. Now, if we go look over here in our functions folder, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder. We're going to call it geocode. Inside of that geocode folder, we're going to create a new index.js file. And there we're going to say module.exports.geocode request is equal to a function that takes request and response and then sends back something. So here we open the function body, and what we can do over here is we can interact with the request and the response that we passed in. So let's say const geocode request is equal to the require of, and then we'll do /geocode. And that will bring in our geocode request. Let's remove this over here. And if we go look over here in our geocode request, we can do something called response.send, and we can send geocode request. Now, if we restart our serve function, what we should be able to see is that when we go inside of our functions here, we'll have a new function called geocode. And if we open that up, what it's going to say is geocode request. So now that we have that part set up, what we can do is inside of geocode request, we can now add the mock request that we initially did inside of our application. So let's do that. If we go look inside our source folder and we go to our services folder, what we can see inside of location is that we have a location.mock.js. And what we're going to do is we're going to move that up into the functions geocode folder. And by moving it there, what we're going to do is we're going to rename it. We're going to name it geocode.mock.js. And we have to do some stuff inside of here. We have to say module.exports.locations. Now, why do we have to change the syntax from export const? Well, this is a newer syntax for exporting. And the way that this function is running, this Firebase function, it's running solely inside of Node.js. There is no fancy compilation happening for it to understand more modern versions of JavaScript. So we have to keep things simple. And we have to use a module.exports notation, which is something that Node understands internally. So we're simplifying the way that our Firebase function needs to understand how it's exporting the locations. This is just something that we need to do in order for the function to understand that locations is being exported. And then if we go inside of our location service over here, what we can see is that our location request is a promise resolve of the location mock. So let's take that away now and let's remove this. What we're basically doing in here is we're ensuring that our location request is now actually going to hit a server. If we go over into the geocode mock in the geocode folder and we look at the geocode mock, we have our locations being exported. And inside of the module exports, what we want to do is we want to say const locations is equal to require of /geocode mock. And so with these locations, we'll name it locations mock. So we're going to import our locations as locations mock from geocode mock. And the reason we have to use require is again because we're running this directly in Node, and Node does not have an import from resolver just yet, as that is a more modern syntax. So we have to adjust the way that we write our code. So do not try to use the React patterns that we've established inside of the Firebase function. Now, if we go over here, what we can see is that there's a promise resolve. We don't really need this anymore. The promise resolve is not necessary as we are inside of a server. But what we need is our location function to take the locations mock of a specific location. Well, what we would call this is a specific city. And the way that we're going to get city is we're going to import a library called URL from URL. And we're going to parse the URL for its query parameters. So we're going to say url.parse right over here of request.url. This is basically server code for us to understand that we're going to be targeting the query params. So if we say const query is equal to this, what we can do is if we go over here and we say json.stringify of our query, what we can see over in the code right here is we're going to have nothing. And then if I say $city equals Antwerp, we're going to have city Antwerp. And if I say city Toronto, if I say city Toronto, it's going to show Toronto. Chicago, it's going to show Chicago. If I say San Francisco, it's going to do San Francisco. So like that, we're able to pass query parameters into the URL. So we're able to tell it what it's going to search for. And this is how we parse that out. Off the query, we can actually destructure something called city. And then if we send back specifically the city, what we'll be able to see here is that when we do this, it's just going to show us San Francisco. And that's because we took the property city directly off of the object. So now we're just going to see the individual place. If we do Toronto, we'll see Toronto. Okay, so now that we know that we have our city, if we go into our locations mock, we can see that our locations mock is an object that contains different places. Now, knowing that, what we can do over here is we can say const location mock is equal to location mock of city.to lowercase. And if we do that and we send back our location mock, what we're going to see over here is if we send in Toronto, we're going to see a result. If we send in Chicago, we're going to see a result. If we send in Antwerp, we're going to see a result. If we send in Portugal, the country, we're not going to see a result. If we send in somewhere I don't know, we're not going to see a result. If we send in San Francisco, we are going to see a result. That's the point here. We're basically moving our mock interface to work against this server that is behind localhost 5001, is a local Firebase function. And eventually we're going to push this up to the cloud and it's going to have a different URL. And then we're going to be able to link our app to that URL in order for it to work end to end as a mock. Right now, we're able to send our mock back. And what we're going to do is we're going to specifically send it back as JSON. So as a JSON object, because if we do send like this, it's not guaranteed that the other application is going to receive it in the right format immediately. So we use something called response.json. And that's going to add some specifics about notifying the browser what format the content is in. And having this in this format now, we can go look at our app, and what we'll see in our app is that we've basically broken it. It's not going to work because we've removed the location service from doing the request itself. Now in the next video, what we'll look at is integrating this request directly from the local Firebase function so that we can get our app to work locally with the location search against our local Firebase function. In our previous video, we moved our mock interface that we had built in our location service to work in the local Firebase function. But now our app is basically broken as we do not have any integration to any type of service returning us data. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a local fetch request. And that fetch request is going to basically be a interaction between our Firebase local function. So this is going to send data over to here, and that's going to allow us to integrate in our location request again. So let's go over here and let's take this URL, right, from here to here. And what we're going to do is we're going to fill that in right there. And we're going to say the city is equal to a query parameter. And we're going to make this a template string. And we're going to say city is equal to search term. And by doing that, we can now do .den. And by doing .den, we now have access to our response. And what we need to do is something called return response.json. Now, you could also do it this way where you return response.json inside of here. And this is going to invoke the JSON serialization. So it's going to take the object and it's going to understand that it's going to get a JSON object back, the JavaScript simple object notation back. It's going to transform it and then it's going to pass it to location transform. And by doing this now, what we can see over here in the app is if we dismiss, and we reload, what we're going to see is undefined is not an object doing location request to lowercase .den. Oh, we have to return our fetch statement here. And once we return our fetch statement, we are returning the promise that is going to talk to the server over here and get this information and then pass it back over into here. And if we go into our transform and we were to log our result, we would see that our result is basically the information, console.log result is the information that we expect to get back from the latitude, longitude of the geometry of the position of the location. So Antwerp would return us a different longitude, latitude. And if we were to fill in somewhere strange, well, that's obviously not going to return us any information. And so it does not change anything in the UI. If we did Chicago, obviously we're going to get a response and that's going to give us back our information. Awesome. So now that we know how our geocode mock is going to interact over here and pass back information from a local server into our application. What we can now do is do the same for the restaurant information, because the restaurant information and all of this information that we've mocked over here in the restaurants folder, well, all of this can also be given to us by the server, and by mocking that request as well and moving it to the server, creating that full server-based interaction will give us the ability to integrate Google later on and just swap out what data resource is going to return to us. And we're going to be doing cool things like enabling a mock parameter, etc., etc. We'll get into that as we move further along this integration. So now that we have this working, let's look at how we're going to move over the mocks of the restaurant info. We have our geocode function mocked and working in a local Firebase function. Next up, we have a second API that we have to emulate or mimic right now, and that is the places nearby search request. Currently, we have a bunch of mock information from this API in a certain shape that mimics it that we are returning to our application. But now we want to integrate this. But before we integrate it, we want to also move our mock into our Firebase function so that we can prove that our app continues to work and move the request into the Firebase function that acts like a server locally. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, first off, we need to go over here into our functions folder, and we need to go to our index. And over here, you see exports.geocode. Now, this is what is releasing a geocode function over here. If we look at our functions, we have a geocode that will be executed. Okay, so we're going to create a second function, and we're going to call it places nearby. Now, places nearby is what's going to give us the ability to basically do a places request. So we're going to create a places request. And this is going to come from /places. So we need to create a places folder. And once we create a places folder, we'll create an index file inside of that places folder, and we'll module.exports.places request. And that's going to take in request and response. And now we can do response.send places request. Once we do this, what we can do is we can go over to our terminal, and we can see here places nearby has been released. Now, if we go down here, we can see that functions index, etc., etc. We were unable to load your code because they cannot find the module places. So places.index, index here. Let's just quickly reload, and then let's reload over here, and we can see that it has in fact loaded now. So if we go to this URL, what we're going to see is here is our placeholder for our places request. Now that we have our placeholder for our places request, well, the next thing we need to do is we need to go look at how we were doing our request originally. Originally, our restaurant request was a request that was just taking the mocks and the mock images from mock. Okay, so let's get rid of this. We know that we're going to need this, but let's get rid of this code. And then let's remove the mock folder. And let's move the mock folder all the way up to the places folder. And we're going to need to do some massaging to the information that's in here. First of all of these imports need to become requires, because the node cannot understand import, but it does understand require. So we're going to change it all to be require. So now that we're requiring Antwerp JSON, Chicago JSON, we're going to change the JSON files to be just regular old JavaScript files, because that's a bit easier to understand for Node. And we'll do module.exports.mocks over here. And we're going to just leave this as const mocks for now, because we're going to do something interesting. Now what we need to do is we need to change our JSON file to actually be a JavaScript file. So we're going to rename every single one of them to .js. And once we do that, what we're going to do is we're going to say module.exports. So we're going to do a default export over here, and we're going to save this file. And if we save it, you'll see that prettier in a ESLint will take over, and we'll rename this file. And once we rename that file, we'll do the same at the top. We'll say module.exports, and we'll do this for every file. And this is just so that Node can better understand the file. The reason we initially used JSON is because it was the original format of the information, but you could just as well just export an object in a JavaScript file and it will work the exact same way. So over here, we'll change this to Toronto.js, and then we'll module.exports. And once we do that, we're basically good to go over here. Now that we have all of this information, what we need to do is in our places index.js, we now need to import our mocks. So we can't do an import. We need to do const mocks is equal to the require of ./mock. And then once we have our mocks, what we can do is we can say, well, how are we going to get a specific mock? Our specific mocks are Antwerp, Chicago, etc., and they're based on this longitude-latitude string. Well, if we go back to our geocode request over here, what we saw in the geocode request is that we were able to get query parameters off of the URL. So how about we do the same thing? We'll do a places, we'll do a parsing, and we'll look for something called location on the URL. Now we also need to import the URL. Const URL is require URL. And once we do that, we can say location over here. So let's go take a look at what that looks like. So if we say now $location equals location, something like that. Well, that currently our server is probably crashing on some error. So let's go look at the terminal. And what we can see is that export const mock images is currently breaking, which is why this should be const. And once we do that, we can just restart our function here. And once we restart that, we can reload here and we can say location equals location. And then we can say some location. And we can see that we're rendering out the query parameter. Now, once we have that query parameter, what we can do over here is we can go inside of here and we can say, well, then return me mocks of the location. And when we do that, if I do this for some location, obviously I'm not going to get anything. But if I go over here to the index and I copy this and I put this as the location, well, now I'm getting information back because this matches the information that is required as the key of the information. If I change this to san and I just said save and I did over here san, let's say location and then empty and I did san, well, now the key is san, so it's going to load that key. So now the location is going to be a longitude, latitude, comma separated. Great. Now that we have that working, there was one more thing that we needed to do. Over here in our service, when we did our transform, we were changing the photos of the restaurants in the results. So let's take that away because that's a very specific change that we should be doing on the server for the mocked information. And what we'll do is we'll say module.exports.add mock images is equal to taking in the restaurant. And then we'll say that it does restaurant.photos. Instead of doing a map here, we're just going to return one singular array. And we'll do this. We'll remove this. That should do it for us, I believe. Now, this one closes that one. Remove that. And now we have restaurant.photos is equal to a specific mock image. Const random image. Let's do this. A bit more readable. And we'll say that restaurant photos is equal to some random image. And then we'll return the restaurant itself. Now what we can do is we can go inside of our function and we can say that const data is equal to the mocks location. And we can say data.results is equal to data.results.map. And then we'll say add mock image. Now, is that what I specifically called it? We'll say add mock image. So then what we'll do is we'll import add mock image. And once we do that, we'll do response.json of data. So now we overrode data results and we made sure that we add the mock image in case we need it. Okay. So now if I reload this, what's going to happen? Well, let's go ahead and restart our emulators. And once we do that, what I can do is reload here, and it says cannot read property results of undefined. So we should only do this if data is available. So if we have data, then we'll do this. And then if we refresh, that should work. So let's go grab a longitude, latitude, and we'll grab Antwerp, and we'll put that in. And what we can see here is that foodies is now being put in as the image. Okay, so with all of that, do you think our app will just work out of the box? Have we migrated it properly? Well, let's go reload over here and let's see. So finish geocode, and then, we still need to implement the service call here. We don't have a request happening. So let's go over here and let's take the same thing that we did over here, and let me show you how simple this is. We'll do a fetch, but instead of to geocode, we'll do it to places nearby, and we'll say that the city location is equal to location. And by doing this now, what we're able to see is that our app works with mock data that is now coming from the server. So we've moved all of our mock information. All of that is now a server call. It is coming specifically from the API. Now, another thing that we should probably do if we're going to do this is over here in our location service, what we did is we have a console log here. And in our context, I believe that in one of these requests, either the restaurants or something else, we put a set timeout around the request, which we shouldn't do anymore because we did this because we were trying to emulate it loading from a server. Now that it is loading from a server, we shouldn't do that anymore. And what we can see here is that we'll have instant returns. It's still loading. It's a bit slower than just getting it locally because it's getting it from the Firebase function that's running locally, but it's still pretty fast. So if we go to Antwerp here now, we'll see it loads. It loads for half a second, and then we get our mock information back. And just like that, all of our services have been migrated to a Firebase function that can now be deployed. In this video, we'll be deploying our Firebase functions to Firebase for the first time. If you do not have payment information set up, this is where the bonus section ends for you, unfortunately, because you require payment information to move beyond this point. This is because of Firebase and Google's freemium plans. They require you to set up payment information in order to do these procedures. Okay, so how do we deploy? Well, if you remember, in our package JSON of our functions folder, we had a very specific method inside of the scripts called deploy. So let's go ahead and run that, yarn deploy. And what that's going to do is it's going to do the same that serve does, but it's going to take our functions and actually deploy them to the cloud. And so it's creating node 14 beta, geocode, and places nearby functions. And if we go over here to our meals to go functions, and I quickly reload, we should see our functions pop up. There we go. It's that simple. And so if we took geocode here, right, it's served now at this URL, this specific URL. Also be aware that all of the information that you see on my screen, you cannot reuse it because we will be removing these functions and all of the credentials that you see me use throughout this section. So please do not try to use the credentials you see anywhere here or the URLs you see anywhere here, as they will not work for you. You have to release your own functions in order for this to work. So if we take this URL and we were to surf to it, by default, it's not going to really do anything. But if we do $city equal to Antwerp, well, that's going to return us the geometry information for Antwerp. And if we do the same for Chicago, that's going to return us Chicago's information. So our mock information is now operating behind this public URL. And it was that easy to release a server that now has our mock information available. And then if we take this and we said $location is equal to, and we went and we grabbed from our places mock folder a certain location here, we would see that we'll get our information back. So all of our mock information is now being served live behind these URLs. And it was that simple. Okay, well, Mo, how do I get this to work live then? Well, it's fairly simple at this point since we set everything up so beautifully. If we go over to our location service and we say over here that we'll replace this part with this, then we should basically, in a very simple way, be linking our actual output of our app to a live server being hosted on Firebase functions. And it works. Right now, we can search and get our mock information back from our Firebase function as if our app was actually running locally. So our data is now live. Okay, it's still mocked data, but it's live. And it was that easy to serve our functions, to update them, to deploy them. And right now we can see health, we can see logs, we can see how many requests are going on, we can view the usage. We have all of this information about how our functions are being used. We've created 2 very small interfaces for our app to interface with to get data back. It was that simple. We now get data back in our app from Firebase, not locally anymore, and it's still the same mock data. And now that we've reached this point, well, nothing's stopping us from integrating with Google now, is it? Awesome. So from here, we'll be looking at, well, how do we extend out what we've done so far? How do we scale it? And how do we integrate with Google? Well, let's take a look at that. Now that we're able to deploy our Firebase functions, nothing's stopping us from shooting for the moon. But we need to set up our code base for scale. Now, first off, as you can see here, the URL that we used before changed, right? The suffix behind here stayed the same, but the URL had to change because we went to a live instance. Now, how do we set this up so we can swap out between both? Well, that's a good question because we want to be able to use both, right? We could say const live is equal to this, and we could say const local is equal to this. And, well, how would we then determine how to switch between const and local? Well, that's a good question. Well, if we did something like console.log process.env.nodenv inside of our React Native app, what we would see if we went to the terminal is we would see that we're running on something called the development node environment. Okay, so we could say something like const host is equal to process.env.nodenv is equal to development, and that would give us either local if it's true or live if it's false. And so with that, we could swap out, right? We could then just say here over here, well, up until here, let's just replace that with host. And that's completely true. We could do that. But we're going to have to do this in multiple spots though. So what I suggest we do is we scale this out a bit more. And what we'll do is we'll say import host from, and we'll do // utils, and we'll have to go over here and see in our source folder, we need to create a new folder called utils, and we'll do utils/env, and then we'll create an env.js file, and then we'll say over here, the live host and the local host are 2 different things. We'll say also, and we'll export all of these. But what we want to do is we want to say export const is development, and that's equal to this. And so now we can use this everywhere if we need to. And we'll also say export const host is equal to is development? Question mark. Then we'll do the local host or the live host. And so now what we can do is we can utilize this in both spots. We can utilize this for over here in our restaurant request, and we can utilize this over here in this request. And so now we're guaranteed that we'll pick the right host for the right environment. So if we went to a production type of build, we would point it to the right host. But it's also easy for us to now control, well, hey, I just want to point it to the live host, so I can just remove this part and host it to the live host. So we have that sense of control here where we can do that. Now, in order for this to now work, we would have to do yarn serve so that we could actually get data back, because right now we aren't receiving anything. And if we reload here, now we're getting our information back and our mock is working as intended. Great. So we just layered on an additional utility that is going to help us scale our code base in a clean way. Amazing. Uh-oh. We tested it on Android, and all of a sudden, our Firebase function isn't working. What's going on here? Well, I'll tell you what's going on. On Android, by default, HTTP URLs do not work. It will only work if it's an HTTPS URL. And in that case, it will actually retrieve information. Now, the problem here is that our local Firebase function does not run in HTTPS mode. So this is going to be a problem. What we can do then is, if we wanted to test it on Android locally, we could just run it directly against the live host, which means you would need to publish your app Firebase functions, and then it would work consistently. This is a shortcoming of Firebase CLI functions. Locally, they cannot run on HTTPS. So the only way to test on Android when using Firebase functions is directly against the live host. Just something to keep in mind here. I'm so excited. We're about to embark on an adventure of a lifetime. We're about to integrate Google Cloud. Now, for a lot of you, this can be scary, and for some of you, this may be completely rudimentary. You've done this before. But for a lot of you, this may be something that gets you excited. It makes me excited. So Google Cloud is one of those things where we're trying to extend our functionality by taking in data that Google is giving us. Google is giving us all of these endpoints, these resources that we can just ping, and we can use them to make our app smarter. Now, if you've never created a Google Cloud account for, basically here on the screen, new customers get $300 in free credits to spend on Google Cloud. So each and every one of you will get $300 in credits when you start an account, but you still need to supply payment information. Now, on top of that, there is also a $200 credit for the Google Places and Google Maps usage. So it would be hard for you to utilize all of that straight out of the gate. But with this usage, you're basically set up properly to try things out. That doesn't mean that you're completely safe of, like, if you make a bad coding decision, you could easily go over $300 in credits. Now, that said, I'll tell you a story later on of how I did this, and it's a stressful one, but if you're on this screen, basically what you want to do is you want to hit Get Started for free. And when you hit Get Started for free, it's basically going to ask you to sign up for the terms and services, and that will give you all of your information. If you haven't set up payment yet, this is where you'll have to set up payment information and addresses and so forth, and then you'll start your free trial. You'll get $300 in free credits. You'll get no auto charge after the free trial ends. We ask you for your credit card to make sure you are not a robot. You won't be charged unless you manually upgrade to a paid account. It's important to note here that what they mean by this is that although you won't be charged, basically none of the services will work without having a billing account or credit card information available. That's why it's extremely important that you do link this to your account. If you do not have that payment information, none of the services of Google Cloud will work beyond your trial period. And so you need to make sure that you have valid billing information. Before we get deep into integration of Google Cloud, I wanted to tell you a cautionary story, and it's a hell of a story. I almost vomited when this happened. Now, I've seen this happen many, many times in my job, working for different clients, when they're implementing Google Cloud provider services. And this is just a cautionary tale. It's not that you need to be deathly afraid of working with cloud service providers, but you have to pay attention. It's not something you want to play around with. And I'll tell you why. on December the 6th, right? Back over here, December 5 to 6. It was an evening like any other. I was just coding. I was coding away, building meals to go. And I was going through the motions of kind of working through all of the different parts that I needed to do. And so I was doing some traffic to Google Cloud, building out the infrastructure. And I had built out a function, a search function that was going to hit the Google Cloud API and the geocoding API, specifically in the Places API. And I had put a function somewhere inside of a render body just to test it out quickly, and I had forgotten about it. I just didn't pay attention. And then I hit a use case where I was trying something out, and it was silently re-rendering. The components started re-rendering without me knowing, and I didn't notice because the app was just there. Nothing was happening. I didn't have any logs anywhere. And so I went away for like 2 or 3 minutes, got some water, came back, and looked at my dashboard. To my surprise, I had done 86,000 requests to the geocoding API. It had silently been re-rendering for those 5 minutes, and it had been hitting the geocoding API continuously, hadn't stopped. Needless to say, when I saw this, I almost puked because you go into panic mode. What did I do? Where is this happening? I don't remember doing any of this. And when I found my mistake, just leaving a stray function call somewhere inside of a body of a component, which is a bad practice to start with, but I was just testing something out. When I had found my mistake, I was mortified. But it happens. These things happen. And what are you going to do? Well, first of all, I had a panic attack. And to be honest, like at that point, well, my first reaction was to contact Google. And luckily enough, they helped me out. They gave me a credit on my bill. They saw that all of the usage was incurred in the same exact moment, on the same exact day, in the same exact hour, and that it was a fluke. And they helped me out. But it's better to prevent than need to get through the situation where you need to go and look at this usage and say, well, now I have a $500 bill. So with that, they gave me some strategies that I already knew, I just hadn't implemented. And we're going to go through that so that you can prevent making a similar mistake. And I've seen this happen at clients as well. But instead of 86,000 requests, we're talking about millions of requests. So you need to be very cautious about how you set everything up when you use a cloud provider. Safety is the most important thing. You need to understand what you're doing, configuring everything to the most granular quota that you can set. And that's what we'll be looking at as well. But this is a cautionary tale just so that you know that mistakes can happen, and there's tales about this all over the internet. And I'm just saying this because I want you to know that you need to pay attention. You need to pay attention because although you have a $300 free quota if you start a new account and you have this $200 quota for the Places in the geocoding API free usage, it's very easy if you don't set up the proper guardrails to go over. Now with that, don't be too afraid of using cloud providers. It is honestly fine. You just need to be careful about how you're coding. So with that, that was my mistake. Now that we know everything there is to know about Google Cloud and all of the safety measures we need to take, we also understand that Google Maps is one of the foremost providers. So right now, what we want to do is create a new project. And by creating a new project, we're going to call it Meals to Go. And this project is going to be where we get our information from, how we're going to configure APIs. So for me, it's going to be in an organization. For you, it won't probably be in an organization. It'll be on your individual account, but just create the project. And then what you will have is the ability to choose that project. I have 2 projects for Meals to Go. I'm going to show you in this project that is now being set up, how to set up the corresponding APIs that we will need in order to integrate. So now that it is set up, if we go over here, what we can see is that on the dashboard, everything is set up with our billing and so forth. And what we can do now is we can go look at what products we need. So the first product we're going to need is the Places API. So we're going to search for Places and we'll select Places API. Then we'll select Enable. And once we enable that API, it is now available on our Google Cloud for us to configure. The second thing we'll need is the geocode API. Now, the geocode API is one that we'll use to translate a city into a location, latitude, longitude. And so enabling that will allow us to basically do requests to get that information. There's two things we need to do. First off, we need to set credentials, and second off, we need to set quotas. So let's go ahead and set quotas ahead of time. Right here, I'm in the geocoding API, which I've enabled, Places API and the geocoding API. And I can also configure it for all of the Maps platform, but you have to set quotas on the specific APIs. So we'll go to geocoding API, and then we'll go to requests. And what you're going to see here is that currently it is configured for unlimited requests per day, 3,000 requests per minute, and requests per minute per user unlimited. This is what can catch you when you, for instance, have no limitations set. It will not stop the requests from coming in, meaning that you need to set limits for the amount of requests you want to do per day so that your costs will be caught if you make a mistake. So what we're going to do is we're going to say for requests per day, we're going to disable unlimited and we're going to set it to 1,000. And then we're going to say we're sure we're reducing the quota. For requests per minute, we're also going to change it and we're going to configure it to be amount of requests per minute that is more reasonable. So we'll set that to 100 requests per minute. That way we're sure that if we hit a limitation within that minute time frame, we can cancel out. And then on top of that, what we'll do is we'll set requests per user per minute also to 1,000. And here, reduce the quota. We can always adjust these based on usage. If we're hitting limitations, the API will send us an error and we can adjust our quota. These are just there in place so that we can be careful. And then on top of that, what we'll do is we'll go to our other API here, the Places API, and we're going to set quotas in place for that as well. Now, it's extremely important that you do this step. If you don't do this step, you're not going to have the safety net of configuring Google Cloud properly. So we're going to set requests per day to 1,000 as well. We're going to set requests per minute to 1,000 as well. And then we're going to set requests per minute per user to 1,000 as well. So all of these are going to be 1,000 so that we are sure that we won't go overboard. And once we've configured all of these, what we can do is we can go ahead and configure the credentials that we'll need. So the last one we'll need to do is over here. Set it from unlimited to a quota of 1,000. And once we've saved that, we've now configured Google Cloud for the safety measure of the quota. What we'll need to do next is we'll need to go look at credentials. And what we'll see here is that in order to configure our authentication, we're going to need something named an API key. So it's going to say currently we have no API keys. What we'll do is we'll go to credentials and API services. And what we'll need to click here is create credentials. And we're going to create an API key. And by creating an API key, we're going to create an API key that we can use to talk to Google. This is going to be our unique identifier that we use to talk to Google. And what we want to do next is we want to restrict the key. And by restricting the key, we'll disable it from being able to be used with certain APIs. So we're going to say this API key is only for Places and geocoding. And we're limiting its use specifically to those two APIs. That's another layer of protection that we're adding in. And now that we've saved this, we have our API key available and we can now use it to do our calls. Make sure you keep that close because we're going to be using it to set up other services and our connection to Google. Now that we have our credentials ready and we've set up Google Cloud Platform in order to be able to utilize the Maps services, the next thing we'll need is a package. It's the Node.js client for Google Maps services. This library is a refactor of the original Google/Maps. It is utilized to use in Node.js. So it's basically a package that we can use in our Firebase function if we want to geocode something, look for directions, etc., etc. It's basically a wrapper around all of the Maps API calls. And so these are the APIs that it exposes. And over here, we can see it exposes the geocoding API and the Places API, both APIs that we want to use. Now, this library is designed for server-side Node.js applications. You cannot use it client-side. If you use it client-side, in some cases it could work, but personally, I would steer clear from that. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this, and then we're going to go over to our code. We're going to open up our command line. And what we're going to do is we're going to do yarn add Google Maps services. This is going to install the client. And then once we have that, we can import the client. Now, obviously, this is the TypeScript ES6 type notation where we use the import syntax. Now, we're not using that. We're going to use the require syntax. If we go over to our server environment for our functions, and we go over to the root index, then we can import the client. And now we have to bootstrap the client in some way. So the way that we do that is we go beneath the import statement and we say, create a client when the core of the Firebase functions start. And now we can pass that client along to our geocode request as well as our places requests. And this client is what we're going to utilize to do our API call. If we go over to our geocode request then, what we can do is we can accept client as an extra parameter. But now we're in a peculiar situation, right? Because right now we're only returning mock information. So this doesn't really help us in terms of making smart decisions. What I want us to do is I want us to accept the second parameter called mock on the URL. And if mock is being passed, that is when we'll return a location mock. Now the way to do that is we have to check if mock is equal to true. Now query parameters come in as strings. When mock comes in, mock will be equal to true or false as a string. And so we need to validate that in that way. So what we'll say here is if mock is equal to true, then we will run the response.json for this, and we'll also return the response.json so that it doesn't continue. After we do that, now beyond this line of code, we can actually accept the ability to return something else. So we'll response.json here, something else. And when we do that, what we're going to see is if we do yarn serve and we try to utilize our geocoding API, if we go over here to localhost 5001 and we do /geocode, what we're going to see is if we do geocode Antwerp, it's going to hit something else. But if we say and mock is equal to true, now we're getting mock information. Okay, Mo, well, why does mock need to be this way? Well, let me remove that real quick. And what we can see here is that if mock is equal to true, it will still work. But if mock is equal to something else, it will still work. And if mock is equal to false, it still works. So it isn't really parsing the value. What it's doing is it's using the string-based value. So we're setting it to false and it's still working. That is why we're checking it against the true value as a string. There are other ways that you could parse this, but we're trying to keep it simple since it's just the mock solution over here. Okay, so now that we know that we can do something else over here, what we're going to do is we're going to utilize that client. And what we're going to do is do client.geocode. And this will accept parameters. Now, the parameters it will accept are the following. It will accept address, in which case we're going to put address as city. So the city we get is what we're going to give to the address parameter, and that will translate into geocode search. And then the second parameter is the key. Now, this is the API key for Google that we just got. Interesting. So are we just going to hard code it in here? Well, no. Hard coding API keys directly into here is not a great idea. So we'll take a look at that in a minute, but let's just finish up what we need to do. Let's add a timeout of 1,000 milliseconds. So it's going to wait 1 second. If it doesn't get a response, then it's going to error out. And what we're going to say is that when geocode returns, the result is what we're going to send back. So we're going to say return response.json of res.data. And this is going to allow us to return the data that comes back from the geocode API. Otherwise, if we catch something, what we're going to do is we're going to take that error and we're going to say response.status is equal to 400. So we're going to say 400, something went wrong. And we're going to say response.send. So we're going to return a response.send. We're not going to response.json in this case. And we're going to send an error of e.response.data.error message. Okay. So now that this is set up, well, let's go look over here. If we look at the way that this is set up and we do mock true, if we say and mock is equal to true, we're going to get mock information back. If we now say it's equal to false, the provided API key is invalid. Okay. So how are we going to give our API key to this service? Well, that's a good question. There are many different ways to look at this, to how to supply the API key. We could hard code it in here and you could go take the API key we just generated from Google, put it straight in here. But we want to go one level above and do a bit more management here. So I'm going to show you a way on how to manage secrets with Firebase. Last we left off, we integrated the Google Maps Node SDK into our application, and we partially implemented the geocode API. But what we ran into is that when we actually wanted to do our request to get the geocode information, our API key was invalid, and that is because we didn't really fill in an API key. Now, you may have gone and tried this out and filled an API key directly in here, but the problem here is you do not want to put your API keys directly in your code, especially if you're going to push it up to GitHub, because now at that stage, it is publicly available. So what you usually do is you have the server maintain the environment configuration. So the server is going to store our keys. Now, how do we do that? Well, environment configuration. Often you'll need additional configuration for your functions, such as third-party API keys, tunable settings. Firebase has a built-in environment manager to retrieve this type of data for us. And so it's showing us specifically how we can do this. To store environment data, you can use the Firebase functions config set command. And so this can be namespaced. So what we need to do is we can do something like this. And when we utilize this, someservice.key is now going to be available to us. After running function set, you must redeploy the functions to make the configuration available. Now you must note here that when you set this configuration, it is not immediately available to the local environment. But let's go through it. Let's see what happens. So in order to set a variable, we're going to run Firebase functions config set someservice key is equal to this.api key. But before we do that, let's see what we have in our current environment configuration. And so the way to do that is to do Firebase functions config get. So if we run this, what we're going to see is that currently, well, first of all, we have to copy paste it, correct? Well, we're going to see we have an empty object. And so now if we do Firebase functions config set someservice.key and we set it to some key, what's going to happen is now when we run our get command, we're going to see that our local cache is storing someservice.key. And the next time we deploy, these keys will be pushed up. Now, I don't want someservice.key, so I can do something called unset. I can do unset someservice, and this will remove this from my Firebase configuration. So that removes it. And if we do the get now, we're back to an empty object. Okay, so what do I want us to do? Well, I want us to do the set command, but I want us to do it in a very specific way. I want us to set google.key, and I want you to set that equal to your API key. So in between these brackets, I want you to fill in your API key, not specifically what I'm typing right here. I want you to go copy paste your API key from the credentials, and I want you to paste that between here. Then I want you to run that, and then we'll be able to see it once you do a get. So if I said something like something here, and then we went and did Firebase functions.get, I want you to be able to see, instead of something, I want you to see the API key that you have right here between these brackets or this string. All right, so I'm going to go do that real quick. All right, so I set mine to store my API key. I hope you did the same. And now the question becomes, well, how do we utilize it now? How do we utilize it in our code? And that's a good question. The way that we're going to do that is we're going to import something called const functions. And so we're going to import that directly into here. And we're going to utilize functions.config.someservice.id. But instead of calling someservice.id, what we're going to call is google.key. And now if we go over to our meals to go and we say mock false, oh, cannot read property key of undefined by geocode request. Interesting. Well, if we did our config get, we saw our configuration available locally, right? We saw it in the Firebase functions config get. So why isn't it available to us? Well, the reason for that is right now it's only stored in memory as part of the availability to push it up to Firebase. It is not currently available to our functions project for the purposes of locally using it. So in order to do that, we're going to have to do something special. What we're going to do is we're going to open up our command line again, our terminal, but we're going to go cd into the functions folder. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do the same Firebase functions get command, but we're going to use the greater than sign and we're going to say .runtimeconfig.json. And so this is going to be the file. So we're going to take our configuration, we're going to put it in runtimeconfig.json. And once we do that, we'll have created a file, runtimeconfig.json. You'll see it over here. It'll be available. And we're going to add that to our git ignore, a very important step. We need to add .runtimeconfig.json to our git ignore. And so now it won't be pushed up when we push up our changes, but this contains the configuration that we can see with Firebase functions get. Now, if we go back into our terminal and we go to the terminal 2 and we quickly restart, because you have to restart. Now it has to load in the runtimeconfig.json. When we do this, what it's going to do now is it's going to read this file and it's going to populate the functions config with that runtime config. And if we go over to meals to go 5001, what we can see now is, wow, we're getting data back directly from Google Maps. And so now I know this because, well, Chicago was something we had available, but let's fill in something we didn't have available. Let's fill in Montreal. And when we do Montreal, now we're getting Montreal's information geocoded to us. And the way that I can prove that we're actually using the actual API is if we go to our API overview here, we can see that in the last 6 hours rather, we just hit some usage. Now it may take some time to update actually. It may not have immediately updated it right here, but in a couple of minutes you will be able to see your usage here. The most interesting part is that we're actually utilizing and getting back information from the geocode API. So let's go take a look at our app, because that should be able to do that now, right? If we fill in Chicago right here, should we get back our information? Well, let's try it out, Chicago. And if we do Chicago, well, that currently is not working. So let's go take a look. If we go take a look at location service and we take this host JSON that we get back, and we say console.log result, what we'll see is that we are getting back the location information directly from Chicago. And the same is true for Portugal. If we did Portugal, what we're going to see is that we're getting back the location information for Portugal. But why aren't we getting back our restaurants on the cities that we already set up, Mo? Well, the location information may differ. And so the mock information isn't matching up to the longitude, latitude that is being sent back by Google. And so what we need to do now is we need to integrate the actual places search, because the mock data only worked against the mock locations, not the live locations that we're getting back from Google results. And that's what I meant when I said the mock information is just the mock information. It does not work between live API and non-live API. Just to prove, that we're running live on the live API, we can do New York. And by filling in New York, we now know the location, longitude, latitude of New York. It's right over here, the northeast southwest boundary and the longitude, latitude. Okay. So we've proven that our geocode implementation works. It just worked out of the box. It's just working because we're not currently running our location service right here against mock. Now, the way that I can prove that is if we said over here and mock is equal to true, well now, if we reload our app, what we're going to see is that when we fill in San Francisco, it works. When we fill in Chicago, it's going to work. When we fill in Toronto, it's going to work. When we fill in New York, it's going to break. And that is because it is not receiving any information currently because it's running in mock mode. All right, so we've proven that our app works live. Awesome. So the next part is, how do we implement the Places API? Well, let's take a look at that. Last we left off, we had geocode working, and we were certain that we were getting the right geocode information. But when we moved towards the live API of geocode, our mock Places API didn't function because of the longitude latitudes not matching up necessarily with what Google was returning us, as Google doesn't necessarily return us specifically the same longitude latitudes that we see in our mock information. Now, for us to fix that, well, there's only one way. We need to implement the Places search request. Now, in order for us to do that, if we go look over here at our Google Maps SDK and we go over to source places, places nearby, we can see that there's a places nearby request that we can do on the client that takes in parameters that will do the call to the places nearby. And the parameters it takes are location, which is longitude, latitude, a potential radius, potential keyword, language, min price, max price, all of these different parameters that will narrow down our search. And so now I'm going to show you how easy it is to actually implement this. Because with a couple of lines of code, we're basically going to fully integrate our application directly against Google Places. Now over here, we need to do something similar in the Places request that we did to the geocode request, which is we need to check if it is mock equal to true. We're going to check and only return the mock information in that case. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to do a client dot places nearby. We're going to open up that function invocation and we're going to give it the information that it needs. So it's going to take in parameters, and then it's also going to take in a timeout of 1 second. We're going to do our dot then, where similarly to what we did in our geocode, we do a then and a catch right in here, and we'll copy paste that because why rewrite? So now we are set up to put together our parameters. Now we have to take in client as a parameter, make sure that we're passing it in at the index.js level. So over here, make sure you're passing your client to your places request. Once we've checked that and we know everything's right, we're going to give it location of, well, you guessed it, location. So we're going to give it, say, location, location. You could shorthand this to just say location. It doesn't really make a difference in it working. We're going to hard set the radius to be 15 kilometers. This is set in meters. Radius is set in meters, so you can set whatever radius you want in meters. And then we're going to say the type is equal to restaurant. So we're going to search specifically for restaurants. And then like we did on our geocode request, we're going to give it the key, which is the Google key. Now we have to make sure that we're importing the Firebase functions so that we can utilize the config that is coming in from runtime config, and in the live environment will just come in through Firebase. So now we're hard linking this. And now that we have all of this going on, what we can try is we can try to load our app against live information. Now it should be hitting places nearby. Well, is it? Actually, I shut down my server just to make sure during my development that I wouldn't hit any infinite loops, error cases, and I could have full control. So always shut down your server when it's not in use. Now, if we reload over here, it's saying that JSON value, height, HTML attributions, etc., is not valid. Well, if we go over here and we did a places nearby request with a hard fixed location, what we're going to see is that in the photos sphere, we're going to have an array, but it's going to contain an object with a height, an HTML attribution, photo reference, and all different types of information. So it's not really a photo. It's a bunch of information to get a photo, but it isn't the photo itself. Interestingly enough, what we can do here is we can say, well, let's just remove the photos. Or we can do something similar to what we did in our mock call, which is add the mock images to the results. So over here, we can say res.data.results is equal to res.data.results.map, and we'll add the mock image to each individual restaurant that is returned. And what we'll see then is when we add the mock image to each individual restaurant that is returned, we can now search for specific places in the world, and we'll get the information from that place, from cities we haven't been able to do before. And we'll be able to see on the map that we are in that city. So we've now linked end to end our entire application live to Google information. And we can search for all types of different cities. We could go for Hong Kong. And then we'll load up Hong Kong and we'll see that where Google is searching is right here in this center from where it considers Hong Kong to be. And the same is true if we did Sydney, Australia. If we did Sydney, we're going to load up Sydney and we can see here that we can zoom in and see all of the restaurants that it's looking for in Sydney. But the images aren't right. We've done the end-to-end integration, but all of our images are mocks. Honestly, we've completed our end-to-end integration against Google. So that's amazing. But the one thing that is left for us to do is to make sure that we can get those images correctly from Google so that we can have our images come in that are actually the restaurant fronts. Let's take a look at that. Now that we have everything working except for our images, instead of running add mock image, we're going to say add Google image. And what we're going to do is we're going to declare a function up here, const add Google image, that's going to take in the restaurant and is going to do something with that information in order to structure a URL that can be utilized. Because currently the information that is available in that restaurant photos is not something we want to use. Now, if you remember, the restaurants contained the photos array that contained a bunch of information. So every restaurant has a specific restaurant.photo reference. So every restaurant.photos has in the 0 index something called a photo reference. This photo reference is something that we can utilize to build up a URL for the information. And if we go look over here, we can see photo reference is a unique key that we can utilize. So we're going to pull the reference and we're going to say, if you do not have a reference, well, then we're going to return restaurant, and we need to do something else. We're going to set restaurant.photos equal to an array where we take a singular mock image right from in here, and we're going to hard code it. We're going to say, hey, anytime you don't have a reference for the image, just grab this image, just put it in there, and we should be good. But if you do have a reference, well, that's where it gets interesting. This is where we want to return restaurant at the end. But now what we want to do is we want to say that if you do have a reference, well, then restaurant.photos should be equal to the following: maps.google API /place/photo. This is a specific API to get a photo. And what it takes is a width for the image and then the photo reference, to which we'll give it the ref. This is the reference of our image that is coming in from our restaurant, and we give it our API key. And by doing this, we're now going to be sending back this information specifically to our restaurant individually. And if we go over here and we reload, what we should be able to see is that we're going to get back the real restaurant images, because now we're getting back real URLs to the images of the reference of that actual place. We're not getting back random images anymore. We're getting back real images. Now, do be aware, this bulks up the amount of calls that you are doing to Google Maps places. This shoots and spikes up the amount of requests, because for every single image is a request to Google Places. So if you don't want to do this, you could easily add back in the add mock image right over here. And you could just work with mock images just in case you didn't want to work with the live images and do as many calls. Now, if we go over to Sydney, what we'll see is that there we go. We're getting back real images of these places. It's feeling like a real application that's integrated fully with Google. And so it's that simple. We just need to integrate some fine bits and pieces from the Google Maps API, doing some requests to specific URLs, constructing client calls. That's it. Two simple functions, two simple Firebase functions hosted on the cloud that can now supply our app with real information. And so now you could go and yarn deploy this, right? You could deploy these Firebase functions. And once you deploy these Firebase functions, you can set your local app to utilize those remote Firebase functions, or you could do an Expo publish and then have that app talk to the Firebase functions for real. And the full end-to-end integration is now a reality. Amazing. Now that we have everything set up in terms of our Firebase functions and all of that other stuff, what I want us to do is I want us to deploy our functions. And we're going to do that by going into our package JSON of our function. We're going to do yarn deploy. We have to make sure we're inside of the functions folder. And we are. And then we'll do yarn deploy. And once we deploy, we'll be deploying our functions live with all of the information. After we do that, we're going to Expo publish, but we're going to make sure that everything is set up correctly in order to publish. So right here, we're deploying our functions. And in order for us to publish, what we want to do is we want to double check outside of our functions right here. We're going to close up our features, and in our utilities environment, we're going to say, well, it's not going to be development, so we're going to be pointing to our live host. Awesome. Everything is good to go. All we need to do now is deploy our Expo application by doing Expo publish. And this will publish a live version of our application in its current state. And it should be a production build, so it is not going to be development anymore. It's going to be pointing to our live host. And if all goes well, we should be working against our live functions. Awesome. So right here, while it's going through the publishing phase, what I'm going to do is over here on this side, you see my live phone. And my live phone is also pointing towards the meals to go that we can load. Now, you can see that I have snacks and I have published projects. So I'm going to go into this published project. And I'm going to make sure that when I log in, mo@beanie.io, test 1, 2, 3, and I log in. Right now, San Francisco is loading up. And as we can see, it's still loading up the mock images. So it has not refreshed. So if we go back home and we refresh here quickly, we refresh again, and we make sure that our functions have been published, which they have. Now, what we're going to do is going to open up Meals to Go again. And let's try to fill in Toronto. And once we do that, we can see, oh, now it's hitting the live API. So now I can go look for specific spots. Well, if we say Bruges, we'll go see what's available in Bruges. Oh, can't find Bruges. Well, how about the, let's see, Montreal. Let's go look for Montreal. And once we look for Montreal, what we'll see is that our app is now loading the Montreal location, and we can live toggle all of the information for Montreal. The same is true for any other place. If we were to do Brussels, we could go look for Brussels information, and now we'll see all the information pop up from Brussels. And this is the live app that I Expo published. So now we can talk to our Firebase functions directly from our application that we've now published. So we have the full end-to-end spectrum going on here. Absolutely amazing. We've covered the full end-to-end implementation of our Google Maps integration. But there's a couple of loose ends we need to tie up. First of all, over here in our location request and our geocode request, and as well our places request, we kind of never turn on mock mode ever again. And this is a problem for many reasons. First of all, what if we want to develop in mock mode? So what we can say is over here, and mock is equal to is mock. And we're going to declare an is mock inside of the env environment that we're going to be able to set to true or false. Now, we're going to do this both for the location service as well as for the restaurant service. And what we'll do here is import is mock, and we'll set it here at the end by saying and mock is equal to is mock. By doing this now, what we can do is when we turn on our server right here in terminal, and we go over here to level 3, yarn serve, and we serve up our environment, what we'll be able to see over here is that if we say export const is mock false, now what it will do if we refresh here is it will go and pull from the live information. So it will go get live places information, which is great. But now if we set it to true, now it will fetch mock information. And that just closes the loop for us on being able to develop in mock mode versus non-mock mode, which is honestly a great way of going back and forth. But there's still one problem we have. Remember when I told you that Android did not have the ability to use the HTTP local instance? Well, I told you you can definitely use the live host and you can deploy, but we didn't really make it easy on ourselves. We would have to do this, and that doesn't really feel super nice. So what we can also do here is we can say import platform from React Native, and we can say const export const is Android, and we'll say platform.os equal to Android. So what we need to do now is we need to determine a way to tell the host to use the live host in case it is Android. So what we're going to do is we're going to invert over here. We're going to say if it is not development or it is Android, use the live host. Otherwise, use the local host. And this should enable us on Android to be able to directly link to the cloud functions. Another optimization, and something that's been bothering me throughout the course, is the fact that we don't really have any type of error handling for this location request right now since we've integrated it. Right now, if we get an error from location request, well, frankly, nothing's going to happen. If I go over here inside of my terminal, right, and I go to the process that's running the functions and I just close that function down, well, now basically, anytime I search for anything else, I'm going to be getting an error. And that error isn't going to be caught anywhere. That error isn't doing anything. If we console.log res here, what we're going to see is that, well, something is going wrong, right? And what's going wrong is that we don't have a network connection. That's the first thing that's going wrong. We're not getting a result. We're going directly into the catch statement. So if we go over here to our context, well, we should be getting an error, right? Console.log error. And what is that error going to tell us? Oh, network request failed. But the network request failing didn't really yield anything. We just have an empty screen, a massive empty screen. And although we're setting the error, we're not really doing anything with it. And so that becomes problematic. So if we take this error, right, and we went over here to our feature, and we went into restaurants, screens, and then the restaurant screen itself, and we open that up. Right now, we're not handling anything with the restaurants error. We're not even importing it. And on top of that, we're not even using our location context error here. So location context, we need that. We can't do much in terms of getting a location error if we're not using our location context. So it's important to pull that error as well. And so we'll call that location error, and we'll have an error and a location error. And with both of these, we should be able to determine if an error is going on. So if we go over here and let's import text from our typography text. So let's do typography and let's do /text.component. And if we take our text component and we went over here right above our restaurant list and we said, if you have an error or you have a location error, right? If you have either of these, if either of these has a value, location error, well then what we want to do is we want to show text of variant error, and we want to say /text, something went wrong retrieving the data. Something went wrong retrieving the data. And if we do that, well, now we have a nice looking text error. But we could go a bit further. One thing we need to do here is we could stand to have a bit of space around it. So let's add a spacer. And let's say that the spacer goes from the left large. And so now it's indenting properly. So something went wrong retrieving the data. Well, now let's say that I went over here and I started my server, right? So I went over into the terminal 3 and I started my server. And I'm just going to be working with mock information. I'm not doing anything special here. But if I go ahead and I reload, well, now I'm getting mock information back. But now if I search for something that doesn't work, something went wrong retrieving the data. So we're getting an error, but the list is still populated. Should it still be populated? Well, no. That's kind of a broken flow right there. Now that we have this error check on the location and potentially the restaurant list error, what we want to do is we want to take this and we want to say const has error is equal to if either of these values is valid. And if you have an error, what we want to do is we want to not render the restaurant list. So if you have an error, we're not going to render out the restaurant list. Now that said, whenever you fill in something that doesn't have a value, what's going to happen here is anytime the error has been set, when we get a result, we're not resetting the error. So we need to make sure that we reset the error every time we retrieve a result. And this is both true for restaurants as well as location. So in restaurants, when we get results, we want to make sure that we reset the error. And that way, if we reload over here, now, if I were to search for a place that doesn't exist, I'm going to get an error. We can't retrieve data for that place. And if I search for Antwerp, well, now we're going to get information for Antwerp. Now we're going to get information for San Francisco. Now we're not going to get information at all. And so we're handling error scenarios. Now there's one more thing that we specifically need to handle here, because this obviously in mock mode will work, but what about in live mode? If we were to swap out is mock for false, will this still work? Well, let's take a look. If we reload here and we said San Francisco, and then we did Antwerp, and then we did some random string. Oh, so now we're getting an error because we don't have the information available. There are no results for this place. Okay, great. That's amazing. But now, let's say that we were in live mode And we did search for a place that had results, right? Like Antwerp. Now, what if I told you that if we deleted our API key from our functions runtime config, what would happen if we got an invalid API key error? Well, let's take a look. So I've gone ahead and emptied out my key over here. And what we need to do now is we need to make sure that we restart the server so that it takes the most recent config. Then we'll refresh over here and we should see something happen, no? Oh, something went wrong retrieving the data. So we're catching error scenarios now. Amazing. This helps the user have a visual indication of, hey, we're not really in a state in which we have information. Something's going wrong. We don't necessarily know what. Try again later. We could customize the message here, right? If I search for Antwerp, obviously it's not going to work because the geocode request does not have a valid API key. And so the user is now warned that, hey, the information is unavailable. And oh no, our map is breaking. So obviously we do not have robust code when it comes to our maps feature, especially in error scenarios. So if we go over here to source and we go over to features, map, screens, map screen, what we need to do is we need to make this a bit more robust because we may not have a longitude latitude, right? So what we need to do is introduce a bit of safety in this feature. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this map. And what we're going to do is at the bottom here, we're going to say export const map screen is going to be a separate component that's going to do something a bit special. It's going to pull in the context of location ahead of time. And what it's going to say is if we do not have a location, we're going to return null. Otherwise, we're going to return the map. And by doing this, we now have the safety of returning the map when we need to. Now, map obviously is overriding with this. Let's call it restaurant map. And we'll just render restaurant map down here. And when we reload, what we'll be able to see is over here. First of all, we have to return null as a body. And we'll see that, well, we're not returning anything. So what we can do now is we can actually customize this and we can say safe area / safe area. We could do a bunch of different things. We could, for instance, just render a map view that doesn't have any type of usage. We could do something like this where we have map view and we just say longitude 0, latitude 0. And by doing this, we'll just render the holistic map view. Let's remove the safe area. What we'll see here is we're just going to render the map without any information. And there's one more nuance here we might have forgotten. If we go look up here at the restaurant map, it's taking in navigation. But the map screen is the one being passed in to the navigation component. And so because of that, if we go look at app navigation or app navigator, we can see here map screen is the one being fed as the component. So map screen is actually the one that is getting the navigation component. What we could do here is we could say navigation is equal to navigation to the restaurant map. And now we've guaranteed that the restaurant map will also get a navigation. We could have also used a hook here. But the point being is you have to pay attention to where the navigation is being passed in. Either pass it down or use a hook. And now that we've done all of this, we've introduced safety into the application and error state management, which is super vital.